Welcome to our first narrative medicine rounds for the 2020-21 academic year. It is a pleasure to have all of us gathering here, though virtually. It has been a shift in how we gather, but we are very, very excited to be here this evening for the narrative medicine rounds, which are lectures and readings presented by scholars, clinicians, artists, writers engaged in the work of narrative interfacing between the narrative and healthcare. They take place, we have our narrative medicine rounds. It's hosted, by the Division of Narrative Medicine in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at Columbia University Irvine Medical Center. And they are held on the first Wednesday of each month during the academic year. Again, thank you for joining us this evening. And I'd like to just give a little introduction to our October rounds to have you please mark this on your calendar. Our October virtual narrative medicine rounds will be held on Wednesday, October 7th between 5 and 7 p.m. Registration for this is free online and starts later this week on our events page. The title of the event is Having and Being Had, a talk by writer Eula Biss about her new book. It's an integration of work, leisure, luxury, and capitalism. For October, again, please just mark your calendar. It's really a wonderful way in which that we're bringing this book that explores the value system behind property, ownership, and the terms we use to understand or misunderstand our relationships to money and class. Having and being had, rather than leading through narrative, turns individual words and phrases like capitalism, consumers, great America, husbandry, art, and work into fields of inquiry in order to frame a life, writes Claudia Rankine, who calls the book a major achievement. Biss's talk will address the pressures that capitalism puts on work and discuss where she sees similarities and differences and how those pressures affect the work of medical professionals and artists. The writer will continue the writer will continue the discussion with creative director Nellie Herman, and Q&A sessions will follow the presentation. I would like to just put a little share ground rules for this Zoom this evening, just so we can ensure that the program goes well. So again, please keep your microphone muted to cut down on background noise during the program. Also, you are now forewarned that there are any disruptions or inappropriate comments in the chat, you may be removed from the event. We're going to lock the meeting right now, I believe. And for security reasons, if you leave the meeting or your connection is broken after we lock the meeting, you will not be able to return to this meeting. However, please know that the event is being recorded, and a day or two later, you will receive an email with a link to a recording of the event. So you will be able to watch it in its entirety. In the unlikelihood that we have a Zoom intrusion, we will terminate the event right away. Unfortunately, we have done everything that we can to make sure there will be no interruptions. But if there is, you will get a new link in your inbox to a new session as quickly as we can administer one. During the talk, we ask people to keep chat interactions to a minimum. As we get closer to the Q&A part of the event, we will invite you to submit questions via chat for our speaker. But before then, we won't be monitoring questions. So please save your questions to type into the chat after we make the announcement. The event is being recorded. As mentioned, everyone will get the link to it a day or two after the event, and you can share it as you wish. At the end, we'll have a link to the online bookstores in order to order the books or find more information about our speaker and about the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics and the program in narrative medicine. I appreciate you taking note of our Zoom requirements, and I'd like to get us going this evening with our first introduction. I would like to introduce a friend, a colleague, just all around wonderful human, is Deepu Gowda, MD, MPH, MS, who is the Director of Clinical Practice of the program in Narrative Medicine and is the first Dean for Medical Education at the newly founded Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine, where he's working to introduce narrative medicine into the curriculum. To date, Dr. Gowda efforts have focused on care to underserved communities, clinical skills, education, interprofessional education, and narrative medicine. Dr. Gowda is a general internist, photographer, and researcher looking at the use of visual art in healthcare settings. He's also conducted research on the effects of introducing narrative medicine methods into primary care clinics in Manhattan, on team function, and is a former Macy Scholar. It is my pleasure to introduce Deepu Gowda, Dr. Deepu Gowda, to introduce our main speaker. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ssanyu. You know, you mentioned that our narrative medicine rounds is a chance for us to listen to scholars, lectures, have critical discourse. And I also want to add to that in that narrative medicine rounds also for me, and I think many people here on this call, has also been a chance to build community. I think some of the most powerful aspects of narrative medicine is that we do engage with issues of the body, of health, illness, society, in rigorous ways and interdisciplinary ways, but we do this in deeply personal ways as well. We share stories. We talk about how these issues affect us personally, how it affects one another, and how it affects the way we're delivering care nationally. And this is kind of a testament to how it brings communities together. You know, this is usually done in the faculty club in Presbyterian Hospital, the room that used to be the library at the medical school and at the hospital now hosts narrative medicine rounds. And yet now one of the unexpected gifts of you know, this era that we're in, despite how troubling it is that we are connected across cities, across the country, and really across the world. And it's the work of narrative medicine that we've found that has been a powerful way of connecting us. So I want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of the event today. And for me, it's a way of reconnecting and remaining connected to my family, the people that are on this call. So thank you so much, Ssanyu. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening to Narrative Medicine Rounds, Dr. Danielle Spencer. I've known Danielle for many years as a friend and as a colleague. Danielle is a faculty member in the Columbia Narrative Medicine program, recently assuming the role of Associate Director of the Columbia University Master's Program in Narrative Medicine. She's the academic director. She's also the author of the forthcoming book that she'll speak to us about today, titled From Diagnosis to Metagnosis: How Retrospective Revelations Unsettle Knowledge, Narrative, and Identity, published out of Oxford University Press. And Danielle will unpack what she means by that title. And one of the teachings of narrative medicine is to honor persons' singular narratives. And we do that with our patients. We do that with one another. And Danielle Spencer's story is no exception. She's taken a unique path in her professional life. And yet, when you hear about her path and what she's writing about, you can see how her interests and her experiences have naturally led her to the work of narrative medicine, to be in this group, to be in this family, and to be here with us tonight to share with us her learnings. Danielle has been engaged in the world of critical thought and in the creative world in her professional life. After finishing her undergraduate work at Yale, she moved to New York, where she worked for the important American photographer Nan Goldin, whose intimate photographs explore issues such as HIV, gender, sexuality, and the opioid crisis. Danielle went on later to work for another 10 years with the musician David Byrne of the Talking Heads as his art director, and from what I can tell, kind of like his right hand. In her recent book that Danielle will speak about today, she writes about Byrne in the very beginning, and we get a glimpse of how she locates herself in his work and also in the work of narrative medicine. She writes, "Indeed, David's lyrics have always explored the relationship between the individual and the world, and the various suits he must put on to enter it. And the question of a specific pathology speaks to the broader question of where to locate pathology, in ourselves or in the enemy of contemporary life." She goes on to write, in his beautiful 2008 song, "Never Thought," he writes, quote, "I never thought my thoughts would be all right," end quote. Danielle goes on to write, "I've always interpreted the song as an affirmation, one which resonates deeply with me, of finding one's place after not having expected to necessarily. To me, it is about navigating one's differences and being able to sing finally with joy. And what I am is what I want to be. That is something toward which many of us, neurodiverse or otherwise, continue to aspire." And indeed, Danielle has been driven to know more about that connection between the body, the identity of self, and the world in which we find ourselves. Her exploration led her to pursue a master's degree in the very early days of the program, of the master's program, in narrative medicine at Columbia. She graduated in 2012, and her work adopted a critical lens, using critical theory to better understand the relationship between our bodies and our relationship to the world. She joined as an associate faculty member of the program upon graduation, and even while working and teaching narrative medicine at Columbia and other institutions in New York, Danielle amazingly embarked on and completed a PhD program in American Studies at Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany. And our colleagues, including Mita, are with us here today. I remember teaching a workshop with her in Mainz years ago, and walking on the campus there at Gutenberg. And she was starting her dissertation and was telling me about her idea of the topic she was going to explore. She wanted to use a philosophical, narratological, and historical lens to explore the connection between diagnoses and identity. And she wanted to do this by exploring her own illness narrative. I thought at the time that this sounded both ambitious and brave, and I still think that is the case. And if anyone can pull off writing a dissertation by working full-time in another continent in record time, it would be Danielle. And I'm thrilled that that doctoral work has now been turned into a book to be shared widely so that we can all learn from Danielle's meditation on a subject that she names, the concept of metagnosis, or the experience of learning in adulthood of a long-standing condition. That Danielle frames the book in this neologism seems appropriate, in that it is in keeping with the way that she has made her way through her own life, doing it her own way. Danielle's work has been published in diverse journals, from Plowshares to The Lancet. She's the co-author of The Principles and Practice of Narrative Medicine, and she has received the prestigious McDowell Fellowship in 2019. So with that, it is a great honor to welcome our speaker today, someone who I am proud to call a colleague, a teacher, and a friend, Dr. Danielle Spencer.
Thank you so much, Deepu. What an honor to be introduced by you. And I could say many nice things about you in return, but for the sake of time, we'll save them for another event. But I'd like to begin by thanking the program in narrative medicine, which is my academic home. I have a great deal to thank them for, so I can't elaborate on everything here. But I'd also like to offer particular thanks to Professor Dr. Mita Banerjee of Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, without whom this book would absolutely not exist, and who provided crucial support and guidance and wisdom at every step along the way. And Mita, I think you're with us virtually, so if you'd like to say hello, that would be lovely. You can unmute yourself for a moment.
Hi, I'm really happy. I'm in complete awe. It's a magic moment.
Thank you, for me as well. And that, and again, to echo some of the sentiments that we've heard, you know, it's a shame that we can't all be together in the same physical space, but it is a gift that we can gather across different continents. And I think that we can be mindful of that. Yeah, just a little bit of housekeeping before I jump in. The book, the name of the book is called Metagnosis, Revelatory Narratives of Health and Identity. And due to the vagaries of the pandemic, the publication date has been delayed slightly, so it's due out next month, but it's available for pre-order. It will exist soon, apart from my own mind and the printouts that I have from it. And the best place to go for links, for purchase links, is if you go to my website, daniellespencer.com/metagnosis. I put the link in the top of the chat because I'll keep that updated with information about the title. And so let me offer you a brief roadmap for today. I'm going to begin by telling two brief personal stories that frame my interest in this topic, and then describe the phenomenon of metagnosis, which you naturally enough probably don't know what it is because it is a neologism, as Deepu explained. And then we're going to go on a whirlwind tour of a couple of different ways of approaching this topic, because there really are so many. And so the first one will be to explore metagnosis in relation to Aristotle and Blade Runner, naturally enough. And then to discuss one example of a real life instance of metagnosis among many. And then finally, to just touch upon a few of the broader implications of the topic beyond the strictly medical realm, which is really my interest in writing this book, is as a provocation, not as an antagonistic provocation, but as a way to provoke conversation. I'm actually reminded of my dear friend Kathy O'Neill, who's here, albeit virtually, who talked about her own book, Weapons of Math Destruction, as something that she wanted to begin conversations. And I think that this is a topic that opens into so many different ways of understanding it. And so I'm really excited about the conversations that we can have today in the Q&A, and then also, you know, once the book comes into the world, what kind of life will it have? And so then after that, we'll have some conversation with Deepu and open it up to some Q&A. So let me begin with two very brief stories. The first is, as Deepu mentioned, I did work with David Byrne for 10 years as his art director. We were also good friends. And a lot of people who first became aware of David as the frontman for Talking Heads, I'm not going to do any PowerPoint or screen sharing, so this is very analog, but I can show you, for those of you who are too young to be familiar with the golden days of Talking Heads, this is a picture from the Stop Making Sense tour. If you can see it. This is just charmingly low tech, right? That's David, and he's wearing what he was referred to as the big suit, which was a big suit. That's what he wore. And then this is a close-up of him. This is the most brilliant concert film ever made, directed by Jonathan Demme. And here he is in the big suit singing. So when I was working with him, a lot of people asked me, well, what's he really like? And you know, the fact is that if you know somebody who most people know primarily through film or the concert stage, that's a pretty common question. It's a natural question. But there was a particular kind of valence to it when it came to David. And I think there was a subtext, which people didn't really articulate that much, but was there, which was, is there something, does he have some kind of condition? Because his stage presence was so frenetic and so amazing and so kind of alien and human at the same time. So they really wanted to know what he was actually like. And in the early 2000s, articles started to appear in mainstream media about what was then called Asperger's syndrome. And he and I were both reading these with great interest, and we both felt that they described him quite well. And I'm speaking about this only because this is something that he's spoken about publicly. I wouldn't speak beyond that scope because it's really for him to decide how much to disclose. But to the best of my knowledge, he's never been formally diagnosed. But the point is that at the time we talked about it and I asked him how he felt about it, and he said that he felt relieved because it really explained a lot of the challenges that he had faced, particularly as a younger man, with finding social interactions to be really non-intuitive. And I was really struck by the particular nature of it being a retrospective diagnosis. I mean, he was already well into his life, and here you have this retrospective diagnosis that then offers a different perspective on one's life experience. And then some years later, I had an experience of this type myself. It wasn't with Asperger's syndrome or autism spectrum disorder, but with a cognitive visual impairment, which means that, well, in my case, it means that my visual field is roughly half of what it is for most sighted people with quote unquote normal vision. And I didn't know about it. Neither did my family, neither did my doctors. It was something that was discovered. And I go into this in more depth in the book, so you can read about it more. But again, when that revelation happened, I was struck by the fact that it was very difficult to communicate the experience to people because nothing had changed physically. I had had it probably since birth. And yet a lot had changed for me because I had an awareness of it. And again, I was struck by this sort of incommunicable aspect of it, that something's happened, it changes your understanding of your past experience, but in another way, nothing has changed. And so I became curious to explore other instances of this phenomenon. And that is the subject of the book. So I define metagnosis as this phenomenon which can happen of having a long-standing condition which was previously undetected and then you learned about it. So by definition, it can't be something where you know you have a problem, but you haven't gotten a satisfactory diagnosis or the diagnosis has changed. I mean, that of course is a topic that's extremely important and interesting itself. But in this case, one's not aware that one has a condition until it's uncovered. So this can happen either because it was just simply never detected. So that's what happened with me. If somebody had done a visual field exam on me when I was 10, they would have found it. Odd that they didn't, but so it goes. And the other way that this can happen is when the diagnostic category itself has changed. So in David's case, Asperger's syndrome didn't exist when he was a child. So he wouldn't have been diagnosed with it because it wasn't, autism existed, but high functioning autism in this way, it didn't exist. Asperger's syndrome didn't exist. And so he was confronted with a new pathological designation for himself in a way that he wouldn't have been before. And in fact, Asperger's syndrome in particular, it entered the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, in the year 2000, and it entered cultural discourse in the years following that. And then, so it came onto the stage, and then it exited the stage in 2013, when it was largely, although not entirely, enveloped into the broader category of autism spectrum disorders. And so individuals, and I'm interested in adults in this situation, adults who encounter some kind of new information about themselves due to either, was just never detected and or because the diagnostic boundaries have shifted. And we talk about these contested and labile diagnoses, I think, a lot when it comes to kids. Certainly people have very strong views about conditions like ADHD, you know, are we over-diagnosing, are we over-medicating, and so forth, but less so when it comes to the adults, although it is a quite common experience. So I coined this term metagnosis. I really resisted it. I didn't want to have to coin a neologism, but there was really nothing else out there. It was just, I was using these clunky descriptors. And it's derived from the prefix meta for changed, that's one of its meanings, and gnosis for knowledge. The reason being that in contrast to diagnosis, what happens with metagnosis is that it affects a change in the terms of knowledge, often. And I'll discuss that in a bit more detail. And in addition to the medical context, which is primarily my focus, but in addition to that, it also describes other knowledge-shifting revelations bearing upon selfhood. So for example, genetic testing, if you do 23andMe or whatnot, and you find out something about your own geographic origin or paternity, biological paternity, that differs from your prior awareness, then metagnosis as a concept can also describe that experience. So in this next section, I'd like to discuss one way of framing this phenomenon, which is in relation to passing. And this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind journey again through the genre of speculative fiction. But we're going to come back. We're going to land the spaceship back on more familiar territory once we get through here. So passing we commonly think of it as passing as a member of another group or identity, typically associated with when one is believed to belong to a particular racial category or gender or having a particular sexual orientation. But it can also occur vis-a-vis socioeconomic class, intellectual capacity, profession, ethnicity, ability or disability status, or even the category of the human itself. And particularly when one finds oneself to be passing, the expected mapping between one's body and the classification is really upended, unsettled in very dramatic fashion. And it provides us the opportunity to re-examine these categories and their constitution, and also their very real effects. And this is where fiction is helpful to us, because in a fictional story, you could just explore the implications of what happens. But of course, it happens in real life as well. So in speculative fiction, I'll pick one example. The modern classic 1982 science fiction noir film, Blade Runner, which explores the premise of passing. It opens with a so-called empathy test of a company employee in order to determine if the subject is human or an android replicant attempting to evade destruction. Pursued by so-called Blade Runners, the replicant's ability to pass in daily life signals really an attenuation of material distinctions, which is to say that you can't just tell by looking at them whether they're a human or a replicant, which really shifts the emphasis to their designation as non-human. And in a common evolution of the passing narrative, one of the characters in Blade Runner, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but you know, the film came out a long time ago. So one of the characters in Blade Runner who believes herself to be human, Rachel, is revealed to be a replicant, in fact, to have been passing without her own knowledge. And she fails Blade Runner Rick Deckard, played by Harrison Ford, Rick Deckard's Voight-Kampff exam, which is a form of the Turing test. And when she remonstrates, because this is news to her, Deckard recounts her childhood memories, explaining that they were in fact implanted in her. As Tad Friend describes this characteristic plot twist of the genre, quote, inevitably the most human-seeming android stumbles into a lab stocked with trial iterations of itself and realizes with horror that it's not a person, but a widget. And perhaps you can think of other examples in this genre in which there's a scene of this type. I'm thinking of AI, for example, the Spielberg film, Kubrick Spielberg film. So furthermore, this is where we get into a little bit wonky, geeky sci-fi territory, but in the 1991 Blade Runner director's cut, which is to say that fans of Blade Runner have very strong opinions about which is better and all this kind of stuff. In the director's cut, which came out in '91, and in the subsequent releases, Deckard who is a boundary enforcer himself, is given reason to question which side of the borderline he rightfully occupies. For here we see, earlier in the film, we see this unicorn reverie sequence of Deckard's, which isn't in the previous versions of the film. And so at the very end of the film, when he comes upon an origami unicorn, this is my one prop, an origami unicorn, which is another character has left in the hallway, in his hallway, he and we, as spectators, we might surmise that this other character knew of Deckard's dreams, and thus that Deckard is himself a replicant possessed of artificial memories. Now, if the frustrated spectator wishes to get confirmation on Deckard's ontological status, is he a human or a replicant, the spectator is going to be frustrated, because if you go to the film's creators and you ask them, you're still not going to get a definitive answer. Director Ridley Scott claims that Deckard is a replicant, but actor Harrison Ford contends that he's not, and screenwriter Hampton Fancher insists that he didn't decide one way or the other. Now, in contemporary speculative fiction parlance, this type of revelation is sometimes termed the tomato in the mirror plot twist. And I'd like to thank my colleague Seljuk Asif for pointing me towards this reference. And this refers to times when a character suddenly learns that he is something other than what he thought himself to be. So this could be AI, ghost, alien, zombie, dead, undead, clone, simulation, fictional character, and so forth. And it's a variant of the so-called tomato surprise ending, which was coined by the editors of Asimov's science fiction magazine to describe regrettable instances wherein a character's identity is hidden from the audience until it's suddenly revealed. So for example, when he turns out to be actually a tomato. I myself can't think of any stories in which this actually happens, but that's what they call it. This kind of recognition about oneself predates Asimov's science fiction magazine. It is a narrative trope with roots in classical Greek tragedy, in other traditions as well. But in the Western tradition, this is one of the key moments where it's articulated. In Aristotle's Poetics, he describes it as anagnorisis, A-N-A-G-N-O-R-I-S-I-S, anagnorisis, a coming to knowledge. It's translated as recognition in most cases. Here's the quote from Aristotle. Recognition, as the name indicates, is a change from ignorance to knowledge, producing love or hate between the persons destined by the poet for good or bad fortune. Sophocles' Oedipus is the paradigmatic example in which Oedipus experiences anagnorisis with the revelation that he has unwittingly fulfilled the prophecy of, spoiler alert, killing his father and having sex with his mother, causing a sudden and extremely dramatic reversal of his situation. So, returning to Blade Runner, just how this revelation of whether he is, oh my God, I might actually be a replicant, that moment, just how this revelation would change Deckard's fortunes speaks to an evolving understanding of the categories of human and replicant. For on the one hand, if he has been passing as human when in fact he's a replicant, he's actually at risk of being exterminated himself. Certainly very real consequences. But having functioned as human and having conceived of himself as such, figures him as human. And so this moment of recognition of anagnorisis prompts a reevaluation for him and for the spectator, a reevaluation of this very knowledge, of this gnosis. And so while Blade Runner closes on Deckard's shock at this possible recognition, in the face of this last minute anagnorisis, the spectator must decide how to situate this potential new knowledge. And the film, again, deliberately doesn't resolve this question for us. So in a way that's somewhat analogous to what Henry Louis Gates Jr. describes in the context of racial passing as a subversion of the notion of an anterior truth subtending racial categories, in Blade Runner, the anagnorisis revealing that a character has been passing as human does not simply expose their real fixed identities as non-human, quite the contrary. For while Oedipus learns that he is really Laios' son and murderer and Jocasta's son and husband, in Blade Runner, vividly depicting the humanoid suffering, some of you are aware of the beautiful death soliloquy of one of the other replicants, And having Deckard as the protagonist, I mean, after all, it is Harrison Ford, really problematizes the boundary between human and replicant and illuminates its primary purpose as a justification to enslave those who lie outside of the boundary of the human. And these plots illustrate what scholar Terence Cave describes as the unsettling quality of ananuresis. For, quote, it links the recovery of knowledge with a disquieting sense, when the trap is sprung, that the commonly accepted coordinates of knowledge have gone awry. So the shift is not so much from ignorance to knowledge, as it may seem, but a movement in the terms of knowledge itself. And in describing Peter Brooks's changing view of ananuresis, Cave suggests that recognitions are now at most partial. What is recognized is perhaps only a fiction. The story goes on without hope of full closure or emergence into the real. The fall of recognition from grace originates in a historical event, the demise of the sacred master plot, the decay of belief in a true supernatural genesis and revelation. So let's land the speculative spaceship back on terra firma, although perhaps now it's not so firma. Okay, now I can just imagine that you're all laughing or not laughing. So, so how does this, why did we take this detour? Like, how does this relate to metagnosis in the medical context, or does it at all? What I'm proposing is that if we think of metagnosis as a form of ananuresis or recognition, as a revelation of perhaps having passed to even to oneself or to others. So in my case, I passed as being, having a normal or normative, non-pathological field of vision, but that wasn't the case. Then when the revelation comes, it affects a similar propping open of the interplay between identity, biology, and the social, illuminating and animating these very terms, and giving us the opportunity to perhaps renegotiate them, because it's something that's upset the normal terms that we're accustomed to. Because as in the fictional narratives, clinical diagnosis purports to offer the sudden revelation of knowledge in the moment of diagnosis. So gnosis, or knowledge, is common to both terms, as clearly in the offing. Like, here's your diagnosis, here's the knowledge. But in contrast, what happens with metagnosis, again, is it really evinces these tales of passing and speculative fiction, because one is revealed, in a sense, to have been in a category other than that to which it's supposed to belong. And just as these passing stories in the speculative genre often serve to unsettle the exclusively realist basis for such divisions, to really interrogate them, metagnosis opens a space for generative skepticism toward biomedical classifications as the sole arbiters of the real. So Odysseus's scar provides a moment of recognition, if you recall, at the end of the Odyssey. He is indeed Odysseus returned home, but not as in Erich Auerbach's famous interpretation of Homeric prose as, quote, a realm where everything is visible, elaborated in Mimesis, quote, here is the scar which comes up in the course of the narrative, and Homer's feeling simply will not permit him to see it appear out of the darkness of an unilluminated past. It must be set in full light. Instead, what we learn is that, as Terence Cave explains, Odysseus' scar is in fact, quote, a mark of a treacherously concealed narrative waiting to break the surface and create a scandal. It is a sign that the story, like the wound, may always be reopened. So accordingly, I may learn that I had a stroke at birth, which apparently I did, and thus I have a lacuna in my brain, which apparently I do, which causes the visual field defect, alongside glial scarring. That's what the MRI report says. But it's not a simple illumination for now. So this is kind of the core of it. So now that this has happened, everything is uncertain. What other scars, so to speak, might I be shown to bear? How might the story be reopened yet again? The former revelation changing in its significance, as indeed actually happened for me, which I don't have time to get into here. But So similarly, if one learns of a condition like Asperger's syndrome, then how might the meaning and importance evolve in the future? As, for example, when the condition entered and then exited the DSM within the span of 13 years. And indeed, there's a characteristic fictitious quality to this kind of reveal. As Kavik describes, quote, "To tell a story which ends in recognition is to perform one of the most quintessential of all acts of fictional narration. The recognition scene is, as it were, the mark of, or signature of a fiction, so that even if something like it occurs in fact, it still sounds like fiction and will probably be retold as such. And such fantastical qualities do not sit well with the positivist biomedical authority imputed to diagnosis." I want to add just like a sort of a sidebar here, which is that what the excerpts that I'm talking about right now really sound more oppositional toward diagnosis and in biomedicine, and that's really not my stance. It's really about the exclusive authority imputed to diagnosis. So calling it into question isn't to say that it's necessarily false. It's just to say that it's not as fixed, or certainly not as sure as we might commonly think that it is. For what, after all, when it comes to biomedical diagnosis, is a source of this knowledge? I mean, shouldn't the condition have been knowable? I mean, at least apparent to the person who supposedly has the disease? Remaining hidden, it has the quality of a feeble trickster narrative, not the true tomato in the mirror realization in which our reason for not knowing about the condition is intrinsic to the character and the plot. But instead, what Asimov's science fiction magazine editors described as a tomato, they disparaged as a tomato surprise ending, a form of cheating. Quote, "There are several classic tomato surprises which editors see over and over. The one about the evil, horrid aliens that turn out in the last paragraph to be humans from Earth. The converse, in which what the reader assumes to be human characters are revealed in the last paragraph to be giant lobsters or worse. But you get the general idea. All depend on withholding from the reader essential facts that would be instantly obvious to whatever viewpoint is used in the story. Were we able to see the scene, and one of the signs of good writing is that we can see the scene in our mind's eye, we would instantly know that the aliens were Earthmen or that the giant lobsters or worse were indeed just that. Then, of course, there would be no story because there wasn't one in the first place, only a weak, very dumb joke. They weren't pulling their punches. They basically wrote this for writers of science fiction so that they could not make these, write these kind of stories so that they wouldn't have to read them. But in fact, these guidelines echo Aristotle's prescription that ananeuresis should really arise from the story itself. Here's a quote from Aristotle: "The poet should always aim at either the necessary or the probable. The unraveling of the plot, no less than the complication, must arise out of the plot itself and must not be brought about by the deus ex machina. Yet when it comes to the mutability of diagnostic categories and the apparent capacity of a condition to not make itself known and then suddenly reveal itself, really violates this coherence, as the coming into awareness of a long-standing disease lies outside of the scope of the necessary or the probable, begging for a more tenable plot or perhaps a better editor." So it violates these precepts for dramatic cohesion. And in fact, it's like a new creature comes lumbering onto the stage, like the fearsome Frankensteinian AI that's overtaking the real. Because these diagnostic categories are supposed to be derived from our image. They're supposed to describe us. And yet here, they've broken out of the laboratory, if you will, and summarily supplanted lived human experience. And so in illuminating the weakness of the tomato surprise plot, Metagnosis brusquely demonstrates that you're subject to this creeping medicalization. You're consumed by this machina without even the pretext of a precipitating change in your body or even your environment, right? It's just a shift in knowledge alone. And even if it hasn't happened to you, it could, right? So this is, as philosopher Simon Critchley says of Oedipus, it could be you. You could be not who you think you are. And so rather than merely serving as an outlier or exception to the certainty of diagnosis, what I'm suggesting is that the phenomenon points toward this fiction of ananuresis, or the unsettling quality of ananuresis, which subtends diagnosis itself. Because once we let this in, so maybe this hasn't happened to you. Maybe some of you have had this experience of this kind of retrospective revelation. And many of you haven't. But the point is, I mean, I didn't know about mine until I knew about it. So once that door is opened, then there could be something else. There probably is something else, right? And so the kind of self-certainty about one's own status is really upended. I could be a replicant. It's just easier for me to be a replicant in this venue. I could be a virtual reality, simulation or something. But anyway, we won't go too far in that direction. So in this sense, and this is wrapping up this section, looking at the speculative dimensions, metagnosis is really a kind of a bellwether. It helps us to question the foundation of our own categories, and it helps us to think about our current trajectory and where it might take us. For the Turing test can be inverted, right? The question, can computers pass as human? Can they become human in a sense, to all intents and purposes, frames the human mind in the model of a computer in a certain way. And so it invites the converse question, can humans become computers? And medicalization can be understood as a vector toward that future or that present. If, as we are increasingly plotted in these biomechanistic terms. And it opens a portal into this process, for as biomedicine and biotechnology and technosocial engineering are all advancing upon us. I mean, here we are communicating through these computers, right? We will all, to an ever greater extent, find ourselves confronting these questions of informatics, technology, the body, categories, and identity, and how they're mutually interactive. So the next section, I'd like to just briefly discuss an example of more real-world metagnosis. And because I told the brief story about David Byrne at the beginning, I'd like to touch upon an example of somebody else who had a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome in adulthood. And the methodology that I take in the book is, well, it's a lot of auto theory, actually, because I speak in much greater detail about my own experience and draw upon that to explore different aspects of metagnosis, and then put it into conversation with other people's stories. So it's a combination of oral history interviews that I conducted, as well as stories from mostly memoirs, things that people have written about their own experiences. And it's important to note, as a serious limitation of the study, that to publish a book, as I am, and as many of these authors have done, is something that requires an enormous amount of privilege. And so this is a serious limitation of the study. This is drawn from a subset of lived experience. And I mean, oral history is an attempt to counteract that a bit, because one can interview somebody, anybody really. But I just wanted to make a note of that. And so anyway, so returning to these real world examples, in many cases I found that when people have this experience of metagnosis, of having a belated detection of a longstanding condition, it traces a certain arc of first recognition. Like, oh my God, I have ADHD. This explains so much. One of my interview subjects said it was literally like seeing my life just played out on the page, every single page. I'm really shocking and revelatory and liberating for a lot of people. But then often there's another stage to it, or two other stages to it, and which are illustrated by this story, which is David Finch's 2012 memoir, The Journal of Best Practices, a memoir of marriage, Asperger's syndrome, and one man's quest to become a better husband. There are actually a bunch of books in this genre. If you're interested, email me and I'll send you a bunch of references, people who've written about these kind of revelations that they've had. And Finch himself is an engineer, he's a father, he's a husband, he's a geek enthusiast, self-described, and he's a writer, and he's a person with Asperger's syndrome, as it was then described. And his memoir traces this narrative arc that I found in a lot of these stories of first recognition, but then subversion, where the categories become really unsettled, and then it provides the opportunity for some form of renegotiation. So what do I mean by that? Finch's story begins with the recognition scene. So it's a classic enuresis, recognition, which makes sense of his past bewildering difficulties. So as he explains it, he and his wife, Kristen, were really having tremendous problems in their marriage. They were increasingly estranged, and it seemed the marriage was really in peril. And she found one night an online evaluation with questions about qualities of Asperger's syndrome, as it was then understood. And she asked him to take the survey. And the questions were things like, do you tend to get so absorbed by your special interests that you forget or ignore everything else? And he answered yes to every question. And of course, you know, this is not an official diagnosis, this is self-diagnosis, but there are similar scenes in a lot of in the literature, a lot of the things that I've read in speaking to people. And when this became apparent, when they were both confronting the possibility that there was this condition and that he might have it, Finch describes his reaction when the results indicated that he was likely to be on the spectrum. Quote, "A few minutes passed as I sat on my hands, rocking back and forth, trying to process what I had just learned. Kristen sat patiently, keeping her eyes trained on me, waiting for my reaction. I was not upset. I was not conflicted. The knowledge felt amazing. It felt cathartic. And it made perfect sense. Of course, here were answers handed to me so easily to almost every difficult question I'd had since childhood. Why is it so hard for me to engage with people? Why do I seem to perceive and process things so differently from everyone else? Why do the sounds and phrases that play in a continuous loop in my head seem louder and command more attention than the actual world around me? In other words, why am I different? Oh my God, I have Asperger's." And this sense of dramatic revelation, this is me again, not Finch, this sense of dramatic revelation is accompanied by a liberating release of shame and guilt, as he describes it. Quote, "The instant my score was calculated, my alienating, baffling behaviors were transformed into well-documented symptoms of a known disorder. They no longer seemed malicious and unexplainable. Kristen understood that the damaging behaviors were not my fault exactly and was able to see me in a new light. Her resentment vanished. I was forgiven." So this initial reaction to the recognition scene, the diagnosis, is very much in the disease model, expressing relief that the source of his difficulties has been identified, and so that now he can, quote unquote, repair his aberrant behavior. And this framing evokes sociologist Arthur Frank's restitution narrative, with the wish to shed the affliction of Asperger's syndrome, which Finch likens to addiction, hyperactivity, or an eating disorder, in order to return to normalcy, as he put it. So accordingly, what he does is he enumerates his ASPE, I should put down the unicorn, he enumerates his ASPE qualities, and he presents the list to Kristen, and he says, okay, this is all the Asperger stuff about me that we need to fix if we want to save our marriage. And so he keeps what he calls a journal of best practices, a list of behavior modifications, and it includes items like respect Kristen's personal time and space, be present in moments with the kids, and so forth. But, you know, ironically enough, or appropriately enough, his approach is really characterized by a lot of his so-called ASPE qualities. And he becomes very focused upon this. And in fact, the Journal of Best Practices starts to drive Kristen bonkers, to use a clinical term. In addition, he starts to question this pathological label for himself. So if we return to the diagnosis scene, yes, he felt liberated and he was very happy and so forth, but he also experienced a sense of conflict, and he had a very unexpected reaction. Here's another quote. One by one, the questions in the survey described everything I already knew about myself, everything that I had always felt made me unique, beautiful, yet removed from other people. Folding my arms tight, I began to cry, which surprised both of us. And so while Kristen welcomes his goal of becoming more attuned to the family's needs, she ultimately convinces him that his ongoing attempts to fix the problem are actually the problem. I should put scare quotes around everything. His attempts to fix the problem are actually causing more problems than they're helping. And she says to him, it's emotionally draining, it's disrupting more than helping. And ultimately they wind up in a place where with her help, he develops a more organic approach, which doesn't demonize or really seek to eradicate these traits, although they both agree that, you know, some degree of self-awareness or amelioration is welcome, something that he welcomes. And so with her guidance, he reaches the ultimate recursive best practice edict, which is, quote, don't make everything a best practice. So if you look at the arc, the narrative arc, this being a narrative medicine event, the narrative arc of the revelation here, his metagnostic revelation, is that he experiences recognition, yes, but if we go back to how recognition is problematized in, you know, from Aristotle through Blade Runner to the present, yes, there's recognition. At the same time, it's also a misrecognition. For the reveal of the condition does not simply illuminate an anterior truth, but it also simultaneously provokes an interrogation of the claims of this diagnostic label. And it makes him and his family and his readers and all of us think in a new way about the terms of disease and identity. And so these experiences can, and in this case, they do prompt the third stage of the metagnostic narrative as I offer an analysis of it, which is renegotiation. So in this case, the family has to resituate the diagnosis alongside the many non-medical aspects of their lived experience, because our lived experience for sure exceeds the medical domain, as well as the particular consequences of the diagnosis. And following this recognition, these stages of subversion and then renegotiation and forging a new understanding, a new reconciliation of the terms of disease and identity becomes the true challenge that faces Finch and his loved ones. So they have to look beyond this apparent binary of disease and identity as they move forward in their journey. So speaking of moving forward in one's journey, this brings us to the final chapter of the lecture portion of this event, which is to think beyond the strictly medical sphere. If we return to the definition of metagnosis, which I just straight up invented, the first definition of the Greek prefix meta is change or transformation, but the second is beyond or above or at a higher level, as in metaphysics, for example. And so just as metagnosis moves us to a higher level of awareness concerning diagnosis, we can now move past and beyond the medical framework toward a broader perspective and thinking about the way that metagnosis operates in terms of identity itself. And so the second sense of the definition that I offer is metagnosis understood as a revelation of knowledge bearing upon selfhood, such as genetic testing indicating genealogy that might differ from one's prior awareness. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about this, and then we'll open it up to discussion. But as you all know, these days, these kind of metagnostic experiences often arise as surprising genetic revelations. And in fact, you know, one aspect of it is that one of the things that you can learn if you to a 23andMe, you know, direct-to-consumer genomic testing kit is medical. You can learn that you have a different degree of predisposition toward diabetes or certain types of cancers and whatnot. And this is another example of medical metagnosis because it's a new kind of category. So if you have a predisposition for a disease, is that a disease per se? sometimes it actually is classified as a disease, but it's certainly an example of where our disease classifications are changing. But in fact, surveys show that most people who do this testing, they're actually a little bit more interested in the genealogy aspect. And these stories of unexpected paternity and geographic origin are increasingly common, as are the crises of identity, which they often provoke. And in fact, 23andMe includes a disclaimer about this possibility in their terms of service. So it reads, once you obtain your genetic information, and they capitalize the G and the I, so genetic information, the knowledge is irrevocable. You should not assume that any information we may be able to provide to you, whether now or as genetic research advances, will be welcome or positive. You may learn information about yourself that you do not anticipate. This information may evoke strong emotions and has the potential to offer your life and worldview. It can also have legal consequences and so forth. They go on. But this kind of knowledge might be irrevocable in the sense that you can't return the knowledge to the store, or you can't unlearn it in most cases. But the experience of this kind of genetic surprise, this metagnosis about oneself, like a paternity revelation, a biological paternity revelation, often provokes this same classic metagnostic arc of first recognition. Oh my God, this explains so much. Followed by a subversion of the categories and labels that we commonly employ. And finally, a renegotiation of the terms of identity. So to discuss just one example of this, writer Dani Shapiro's 2019 Inheritance, a memoir of genealogy, paternity, and love, tells such a story and illustrates these stages. It begins with an ancestry DNA test taken in her 50s, indicating that her father was not her biological parent. And she didn't have any particular reason to take the test. Her husband was doing it, I think, and they could do 2 for the price of 1 or something like that. And so she just did it. And so the revelation does prompt a degree of recognition. For as she explained in an interview, she had a lovely childhood, and yet, quote, there was a feeling that I always had, that I had from time to time, from the time I'm able to remember, a feeling outside of things, or like I didn't belong, or like something wasn't right, something I couldn't put my finger on, but that I felt to my bones. But because there was no reason to feel it, I just internalized that. I think the way children do, that there was something the matter with me, that I was feeling so other from my family. And in family photos, as she describes, quote, I was the lone, pale, blonde child in the sea of dark-haired, dark-eyed grandchildren and great-grandchildren, my otherness and difference glaringly evident. She was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, but people routinely questioned her Judaism. She was literally the Kodak Christmas poster child, meaning she was actually on the Kodak Christmas poster. She recalls Jared Kushner's grandmother, sorry to invoke politics, Jared Kushner's grandfather clutching her and telling her, we could have used you in the ghetto, little blondie. You could have gotten us bread from the Nazis. And a friend's memory of poet Mark Strand staring at her and repeatedly declaring, you aren't Jewish. There's no possibility you're Jewish. And in addition, Shapiro learned in early adulthood that she was conceived via artificial insemination. This was in the early days of that. And that mixing donor semen with the intended fathers was a common practice during that time. But despite these clues, she hadn't questioned her biological parentage, and the information completely subverted her sense of identity. Quote, I never had any doubt that I was part of the chain that reached back and back through the generations unbroken, she explains. Yet with the DNA results, quote, it felt as if the links of that chain were in pieces on the floor all around me. In describing the dislocating effects, she also likens her life to a large, intricate jigsaw puzzle, which, when completed, has another image on the reverse. Quote, same puzzle pieces, same materials, same shape, different picture. And also to an archaeological ruin, quote, my entire history, the life I had lived, had crumbled beneath me like the buried ruins of an ancient forgotten city. And reeling from this shocking collapse of her sense of self, she becomes animated by the quest to relink the chain, redo the puzzle, rebuild the city, if you will, and reclaim her identity. quote, if my father wasn't my father, she asks, who was my father? If my father wasn't my father, who was I? Now, in the course of this mission, Shapiro does locate her biological parent, and she recounts that story. It's part of the memoir. But she remains tortured by the question of whether her mother and father, both now deceased, knew. For as she learns, mixing donor semen was typically described in that era as a treatment to help the father's sperm, the intended father's sperm, and whether they withheld this information from her, a possibility which she experiences as an excruciating betrayal. And while she doesn't find a definitive answer, her parents are no longer alive when she embarks upon this quest, she comes to understand that she has inherited the trauma, as she puts it, that they experienced in keeping a secret which was perhaps both known and unknown. As Shapiro describes the rupture of this metagnostic revelation, quote, I had become divisible, in part the same, in part different. A fundamental law of identity, my very sense of self, broken open. Yet as she struggles with this feeling of darkness and feelings of having lost her father, as she puts it, she begins to understand the knowledge that she's received. This is going back to the genetic information, the irrevocable knowledge. She begins to understand it not as the irrevocable receipt of fixed genetic information, capital G, capital I, but rather knowledge as a means of seeing in a different way. As her father's 93-year-old sister, Shirley, explains to her, quote, it's rare that you get an opportunity in life to stand outside yourself. It's as if the Holy One, blessed be He, is saying, child, come sit next to me and now look. Finding all this out is a door to discovering what a father really is. It isn't closure. You may not get to have that, but it's an opening to a whole new vista. And following the recognition and subversion wrought by this revelation, Metagnosis changes Shapiro's way of knowing and seeing, and she finally looks and she finds her father and herself anew. She closes the memoir by describing herself giving a reading, and her biological parent is in the audience. But as she explains, quote, there is another man, the one who loved me into being, beautifully echoing Mr. Rogers' phrase, who I am looking for. I silently call to him, a Hebrew word, Hineni, here I am. And I say it to my father again and again, Hineni, I am here, all of me. Now, in the beginning of the memoir, Shapiro cites 18th century philosopher Thomas Reid on the indivisibility of identity. Quote, the identity of a person is a perfect identity. Wherever it is real, it admits of no degrees, and it is impossible that a person should be in part the same and in part different, because a person is not divisible into parts. Here, Shapiro echoes writer Andrew Solomon, who in his Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, commendably argues against attempts to obliterate identity in view of, quote, the law of identity, which states that everything is the same of itself, drawing upon Aristotle and Locke. It is this sense of inviolable identity which is identical to itself, what Solomon terms the personal tautology, which Shapiro describes as so broken and transformed and crumbled by the paternity revelation, the genetic paternity revelation. Yet, status post metagnostic shock and subsequent reactive metaphor hyperplasia, for the clinicians among you, Shapiro has no further need to cast about for these symbols which clash and crumble, just like the subverted identity that they're meant to denote. For now, the terms of the real have been recovered. She has reassembled herself, likening herself not to anything else but her own self, indivisible, whole again, and here, Hineni, all of me. But what I'm suggesting is that in the process, the law of identity has actually been rewritten, and the terms of the self and the real have been renegotiated, demonstrating that they are not fixed, but fluid. And as we learned from Aristotle and Blade Runner and so forth, they're susceptible to reopening. The chain is never completely whole. The jigsaw puzzle is never completely fully fit together. The city is never finished being built. For as the law of identity now more appropriately describes the status of these seemingly indisputable diagnostic labels, so too it can be said to apply to this capital G, capital I genetic information, the irrevocable knowledge which cannot be returned to the store but can alter your life and worldview, as 23andMe puts it. And just as an individual must renegotiate the potential discordance between the biological, the experiential, and the social revealed by medical metagnosis. Shapiro wrestles with these categories and with the terms of the seemingly inviolable genomic real, finding that her real father is not the man whose DNA she shares, but the one who, again, as she so movingly describes, loved me into being. And Shapiro is ultimately a writerly reader of the Revelation, and she rejects genetic essentialism and pens this memoir of, as she puts it, genealogy, paternity, and love, all intermixed and seen anew. So to finish up, I'd like to point out that these kind of stories can help us to better understand metagnosis and its implications, and developing this skill is increasingly important because, again, these revelations can now arrive from the most unexpected quarters. For example, Jennifer Finney Boylan reports that, quote, "The results of my friend Chloe's DNA test are in, and her father is not who we thought. Chloe is not 100% black Labrador retriever, but in fact half flat-coated retriever." And as we've learned, the first metagnostic phase is often one of recognition. And indeed, it turns out that Chloe's distractibility, not to be unduly essentialist, is a characteristic trait of flat-coated retrievers. But then recognition is followed by a sense of subversion. Quote, "Suddenly I own a different dog than I thought, although the dog I own has not changed. Chloe is herself, and yet not herself." And finally, there's a renegotiation of the terms of identity accompanied by another sort of realization, which echoes Shapiro's, not to trivialize it, but to echo Shapiro's response to her own paternity revelation, seeing the bonds of care anew. As Boylan describes, quote, "I'm still left with a suspicion that the question of who we are will always remain a mystery, not least because we are so much more than our genes. There's no one who can tell us who we are except ourselves. Chloe, for her part, is unconcerned. 'You really don't know who you are or why you're here,' she says to me with her soft brown eyes. 'We are here to love one another and to be loved.'" Wait, what were we talking about? And in closing, what we are talking about is that in the wake of what I'm calling a metagnostic shock, we need not stop seeking. We need not simply embrace the indivisible, inviolable self, Shapiro's reassembled all of me, restored to the family portrait, the chain, the jigsaw puzzle, and the city, made whole and no longer needed as figures to describe the self. For metagnosis reveals that the personal tautology never existed in the first place. The tomato in the mirror was never just a tomato. Instead, metagnosis is a kind of a metafictional diagnosis, which affects this worldly deconstruction, reminding us that knowledge, narrative, and identity were always already in flux, and they still are, and they will remain so. And so as we sail into the unknown unknowns of our cyborg selves in this era of radical change and radical uncertainty, and as these speculative fictions quickly become our multiple realities, we must practice clinical ontology. I'm cribbing from Oliver Sacks here. Clinical ontology, asking not just how we are being, but how we are becoming, individually and collectively. And the question's meaning must be renewed by each use. And we must pay attention to the stories we tell and how we tell them, as well as those we do not tell and do not hear. And we must mind the ways that we name ourselves and are named by others. And we must resist polarization and recognize that identity is in constant motion, continually renegotiated and reconstructed. And finally, metagnosis as a change in knowledge offers us the opportunity to explore this freedom. We may not have been aware, but in fact it was there all along. So with that, I close my much talking portion, and Deepu, welcome you back to the stage.
Danielle, thank you so much for that discussion, and congratulations on this work and this book. So let's you and I have a conversation for a few minutes, and then we'll transition to opening up questions from the audience. First thing that comes to mind is maybe we need to start pronouncing diagnosis differently. Gnosis, no, and dia from apart we pronounce that diagnosis, and we don't say diagnosis. I feel like we need to change that.
Well, the question of whether there's a hard G in metagnosis is really open for debate because it's a neologism. So perhaps we can take a poll here and figure out that or what as well.
I like that. You know, this was a great conversation in so many directions. I wanted to start with, you know, this idea of clinical ontology, this idea of how we are becoming. You know, your conversation, you were saying is not opposed to biomedicine, but it is a skepticism of biomedical categories in some ways. What does this have to teach clinicians and the healthcare system, your scholarship?
Yes, good question. I think that, well, first of all, in a more immediate pragmatic way, that this kind of experience of this retrospective revelation is something that doesn't really fit well into the normative medical narrative. You know, it's more like, oh, you know, so in my case, you know, I got this diagnosis, and really the concern was to make sure that it wasn't, that this visual field defect wasn't due to glioblastoma or, you know, new onset MS or something like that, which obviously I was very concerned about those possibilities too, and thankfully it was neither of those things. But the experience of dealing with a revelation didn't really fall within the parameters of clinical practice. I mean, it was more like, okay, we've got the diagnosis, you know, we're all set. And so I think becoming aware of it can help clinicians to become attuned, you know, and this is really a fundamental orientation of our field, become attuned to the different ways in which people experience health and disease. And it also, but also on a more epistemic level, which has to do with knowledge and knowledge claims, the phenomenon really does kind of poke at the authority of clinical practice, because both in the sense of, in both senses of metagnosis. So in one sense, if, you know, so my visual field defect wasn't caught, right? Well, it really should have been. So that's kind of a, you know, some clinicians have egg on their face because they didn't catch it, right? And then in the other sense too, when you have changing diagnostic classifications, that also is it's a little hard to hold on to the, you know, the inviolable authority of diagnosis when Asperger's syndrome, again, like entered and then exited the DSM within 13 years, or, you know, as happens with many other conditions. But I think this is
really asks for some humility, doesn't it, from the side of clinicians and healthcare, that there's not one single answer coming from a biopsy or from a genetic test with respect to what's going on with a patient. And even that is mutable over time. Right.
Well, see, you understand. But you're an enlightened clinician, so.
What do you, I mean, I'm curious to asking you these questions because, you know, healthcare training is constantly in evolution, and we're asking, are we training our clinicians and healthcare teams in effective ways? And our field of narrative medicine, and the field that you're really pushing forward, is a part of that next phase of how we're training physicians. And I think to ask these questions and to interrogate, are the types of conversations that we're having here, are they getting into actual training grounds of physicians and nurses and social workers? Do you have a sense that they are, or do you feel like these are kind of peripheral conversations?
I mean, that's really the key question. And I feel that you could speak to that also, Deepu, because you're setting up this, you just launched a new medical school. I think we've made some progress, but I mean, there are many who are here virtually who are doing this work, and we know that sometimes there can be a lot of resistance, because if it seems like one is saying, you know, like poking a little bit at the, you know, the certainty of these biomedical claims, then there's often, in my view, a kind of a knee-jerk response, which is to say like, oh, are you saying that there's no validity to biomedicine at all?
Yeah.
And it's not what I'm saying by any means. Please let biomedicine learn as much as it can and help us all.
Yeah. Thank you, Danielle. You know, I was curious to know how writing of this manuscript helped you get to know yourself?
Well, that presumes that it did. That it did help me
Good
get
question. Good point, Danielle. Did it? And if so, how?
I think so. You know, this sort of auto-theoretical aspect to it, where I really unpacked my own experience, was something I really didn't want to do. It's quite personal in that way, and in regular life, I have the option to share it with people or not, and it's not the thing that I think is primary or determinative about me. But I had to question that because I ultimately did write about it in service to the project, and I also felt that it's part of the broader goal of destigmatizing medical conditions and opening up a space where critical discourse and memoir and auto theory can become enmeshed in a productive way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you feel that in academic circles that represents a kind of new territory to be explored, to honor or to explore one's own self in expanding theoretical understandings?
It's not new. I'm certainly not the first. And if you look, I mean, there's a lot of work, particularly in critical race theory and gender studies, and disability studies, in which one's own situated experience is a starting point. And in the health humanities and narrative medicine realm, there are writers who've done this: S.K. Toombs, Javi Carrel, Arthur Frank. And so I feel that I'm, entering the discourse in that way. But I think it's still easier to just write a straight up, something that can be categorized in one way or the other. And I have to give Mita credit for this, because when I embarked upon this project, I was concerned that it wouldn't be a standard dissertation or a standard academic book, and she really encouraged me to explore that hybridity.
Mm-hmm. What was that like for you to make that decision to, disclose parts of your own illness narrative? Was there a kind of vulnerability that came out of that?
There is, although I think that the book hasn't actually come out yet, and this is the first event that I'm doing, so we'll see what happens. But I mean, I feel fine about it now.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you just about the process of writing this book. As I mentioned in the introduction, you were working full time here in New York in various places, really, and working with Mita in Germany, Skype calls back and forth. What was that process of writing, and how did you move it along? And I ask partly because in our narrative medicine community, there are a lot of people who are writers and who are working on articles or books or manuscripts of their own, and there may be some lessons in there, because you were able to move this along in a pretty rapid pace.
Yeah, well, I had the idea for the topic years earlier, and in fact, I worked on it a little bit for my master's thesis in the narrative medicine program, and I conducted some interviews and did a little bit of the early conceptual work, and then I put it down for a number of years. And when I returned to it, I had a clearly formed idea of the topic, but I didn't really know what I was going to say about it. It was just an open question. I thought, here's this phenomenon that seems really odd, but interesting and relatively underexplored. And so I'm going to dive into it. I think this approach of asking interesting questions is one that I was raised with. My father, who's here somewhere, is a mathematician, and his mentor was one who, asked interesting questions. And so, but yeah, in terms of the day-to-day practice of it, what can I say? It's all I did. It was just a monomaniacal focus. Sorry, I shouldn't put pathological terms, but for about a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's really helpful to anybody. So
I think it shows, it illustrates the dedication required to move something like this along. Thank you, Danielle. And also just the support that you had with mentors in the narrative medicine program and also at Gutenberg. I wanted to open this up for questions from the audience. So if you could just place your question in the chat box, and we will be scanning the questions, and we'll select a few of you to unmute yourself and to speak out your question when asked. And actually wanted to start with a question that we got already from Dr. Banerjee. Mita, if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really intrigued by, I mean, as you know, with the comparison with passing. And so, as you were speaking, I thought there's a sense of vulnerability, right? I mean, historically, the idea of passing was also the fear of being found out. What if somebody catches you? And that is a sort of diagnosis that is final. So I was wondering whether you could speak a little bit about the moment of vulnerability, but I was really intrigued by how you then move beyond that, how that decision is actually not final, because the space that you open up through metagnosis is actually, much wider than we would have ever thought, right? So because it changes the category. So the relationship between vulnerability and transcendence really intrigues me, because this is where you move beyond actually critical race theory, and diagnosis.
Well, thank you, Mita, for that wonderful question. Yes, this is making me think about it in a slightly different way. So maybe an earlier stage, I'm thinking about disability studies scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson, who she's writing about some of the defining aspects of disability. And she writes, quote, "Staring is the social relationship that constitutes disability identity and gives meaning to impairment by marking it as aberrant or aberrant. Even if disability is not apparent, the threat of its erupting in some visual form is perpetually present." And I think that speaks to the vulnerability question. So if you learn that you have a condition, then there is a lot of vulnerability, but it's really variable. I mean, it depends upon what the condition is and what situation you're in, right? Is there a stigma attached to it? Is it going to limit you from life activities that you otherwise would like to engage in? How are people going to see you differently and so forth? And I certainly struggled with that with my own revelation, because my experience didn't really map onto these categories in a sensical way. I mean, I technically I have visual impairment, but I'm very visually functional, and so I doesn't really fit. So yes, ultimately, by tracing the arc and showing that one of the things that metagnosis does, and not just for people who have this particular experience, but the idea is that it has much broader implications, is that it makes these categories less fixed and less defining. And it's kind of ironic because this kind of revelation is not as widely recognized. In a way, if you're privileged enough to be able to situate it, however you choose to, then there's kind of more latitude than there is with other conditions where there are predefined cultural scripts for how it's supposed to define you or not define you. But what I'm trying to do is to forge a path to say, well, here is this way of opening it up, so that these to deconstruct the definitions and restore more agency to the individual, with the hopes that ultimately this will help to liberate us all. Not to be too grandiose about it, but that is the ultimate hope.
Thank you, Danielle. Going to ask Swathi to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spencer, for this wonderful talk. It was amazing. I was just wondering about the entire process of metacognosis, because I was thinking of how it's not just an event, but it's kind of a sort of a phenomenon that creates a gap between the previous self and the transformed self or the new self. So I was wondering, how does this transformed self build up a relationship with the old self or the unmetacognostic self. So how do they view themselves? Do they view themselves as the detached other or the unmetacognostic other? And what kind of a relationship is there? Is there a plasticity involved in the kind of the new self? Do they view themselves as the completely different human being that they were before? So I was wondering about all of that.
What a wonderful question. See, now I need to rewrite the book again now that I have these beautiful articulations of how to understand it, really. Well, I was just saying this is such a, I mean, opens up into many different dimensions, but I'll say one thing, which is that one of the things that the experience evinces, you know, that it evokes in people who experience it, is exactly that question of how the individual sees their current self in relation to a past or future self. And the philosophers amongst us know that this is a fundamental question of personhood. And it's also something that's very relevant for our field of narrative medicine, which really takes as its premise what's called in some circles the narrative identity theory, which is that I experience my life in this context of a narrative, right? But there are a lot of different views on this matter. This has been hotly contested in the pages of narrative. Galen Strawson who's a literary theorist and critic, mounted a vehement critique of the narrative identity thesis and said, no, that's just not true. And actually it's harmful. In fact, there are different types of people. There's the diachronic, which is the person who experiences themselves as a more continuous way in their past, continuous with their present. And then there's the episodic, who less so, you know, where here I am today, but what I was before, it doesn't really interest me that much. Not to, I mean, just to give a very blunt summary. And in that case, so then you say you have an experience of metagnosis. Well, how people respond to it is going to vary considerably. And one of the factors is how do they conceive of there being a relationship between their past self and their present self, or do they not care, right? So for some people, the same revelation of the same conditions, say at the same age, could provoke a profound experience of discontinuity, to your point. Like, well, this previous self didn't have this knowledge, and now I do. Now I have to revisit my whole childhood and reevaluate it in light of this knowledge. Whereas somebody else might say, oh, okay, well, now I have this knowledge, so is it useful to me or is it not? Like, okay, I have ADHD, so should I give Ritalin a try? Maybe it'll be helpful, maybe it'll be harmful. Like, it's more practical knowledge. So again, going back to the deconstructive aspects of this phenomenon, is it kind of, or the way that it props open things is one thing, it reveals the stance that one might have toward narrative identity in interesting ways that maybe you hadn't had to think about before, if that makes sense. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Swati, for that wonderful question. If Sahib Singh can unmute and ask your question. Sahib, are you able to unmute? Let me go ahead and ask the question, Danielle. Sahib writes, I've known parents who have withheld information from their children, including diagnoses of ASD and even childhood cancer diagnosis and treatment. Do you have any opinion on this to benefit parents? How traumatizing could late recognition be in addition to discovering your parents have withheld knowledge?
Well, that is a really important question, but I want to be clear that that lies a little bit outside the scope of this project, because I intentionally limited this investigation to the phenomenon as it happens with adults. Because when you're talking about kids, you know, they're children, and so they have people making decisions on their behalf. But I will say that, you know, so there can be very good reasons for sharing or you know, not disclosing information, and I don't presume to speak to that. But I will say that that there are instances where, like for example, in Dani Shapiro's memoir, it wasn't really that she was so discomfited by the idea that her her father was not her biological parent. It was that her parents had not told her the truth, that they hadn't told her. She's tormented by that, and I think that's just something to consider. Because then if somebody does receive the knowledge, but then they think, well, this knowledge could have been helpful to me and somebody could have told me, then that's some, it's an important consideration.
Thank you, Danielle. Deborah Dewsome, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my question, I'm a psychiatric nurse, and so of course, I'm always involved with mental health folks. And part of that is people will receive a diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis. And many individuals feel a relief at having a diagnosis, that it explains themselves to them. But then there's this other side of getting a diagnosis, because the diagnosis then creates a whole lot of stigma and preconceptions, and that I find that people go through this experience of who am I now, right? And that I don't know, and I wonder if physicians, psychiatrists, people working in the field are sort of aware of that aspect when they give a diagnosis, particularly in an area that is highly stigmatized to people, and how that might affect their sense of self or sense of identity.
Yes, I think that's a really important point, particularly when it comes to mental health. This is what one scholar, Ian Hacking, calls looping effect, which is, and he's talking about psychiatric diagnoses, which is that the diagnosis is itself, as he puts it, quote, a source of narrative affecting the diagnosed subject's self-conceptions and possibilities for self-development. And to your point, you know, the question then arises, well, are these effects harmful or helpful? You know, sometimes they can have aspects of both at the same time. I think there is an awareness of these effects now, but it's something that we need to make considerable progress in raising that awareness, particularly for these stigmatized conditions. I think anybody who works in mental health or adjacent to it is aware of this, but it's something we need to work on. I'm just trying to remember the name. I'm just reading this memoir about a woman who has schizoaffective disorder. I'm sure somebody can help me out with the title, or I can look it up in my purchase list. But she talks a lot about the particular diagnosis that she received, and how it put her into a category where then she had to face, you know, this tremendous stigma. And she had a different diagnosis before, and then she was given this diagnosis. And so it's a question of great importance. So I think that one of the effects of this topic, you know, that I hope will have this effect, is that it draws attention to the impact of the diagnosis itself. Because you know, what I'm talking about is kind of a limit case where you haven't developed a new disease or been injured or something like that. You just get a new diagnosis sort of out of nowhere, right? And so, but it's kind of provides you the opportunity to then see, in absence of these other changes, what are the effects of the diagnosis? So that speaks to your point, is to say, well, how does a diagnostic label, what are the effects of it, for better, for worse, or both at the same time? And what can we do with that information? How can we help people?
Thank you, Danielle. Appreciate your question, Deborah. I'm going to go to Rita Sharon, who has a question.
Thanks, Deepu. Thanks, Danielle. Wow. Wow. And I've read the book, but it was thrilling to hear you give the book, because it gets better. I have a technical question. I hope you're thinking about preventive health care for future, I don't want to say sufferers, but future persons who will undergo metagnosis. We image better than we ever did, like in your case. So we're going to be finding things that we didn't know were there, usually, you know, casually, incidentally. We have new diseases, Danielle. There are more and more diseases every day. The Dear to Human Genome Project never stops spewing out new diseases. So the combination of drastic increase in imaging and drastic increase in new diseases means metagnosis is going to be an epidemic. So how do we offer preventive care? How do we offer some kind of philosophical identity positioning to make this not be a disaster?
Yes, Rita, thank you for the question. You really, as usual, you really bring us to the most important pivotal aspect. And well, ultimately, I make a very broad claim, which is that again, here's this kind of limit case that I'm looking to. But to your point, exactly. I mean, if it hasn't happened to you yet, guess what? It will, or it already has, and you're just not aware of it. I mean, you know, we're in this time of exponential change, truly, in terms of medical technology and knowledge. And I mean, our world is changing so dramatically. And so we are going to find out that there are aspects of what we think of as being ourselves and our personalities that we can be plotted on spectra as yet unimagined, right? It's already happening. You know, stick somebody in an fMRI machine and you find a lot of things you maybe don't want to find, right? And so by looking to this limit case, which is what I'm doing in this project, it's really with a view toward having it affect all cases, which is to say that if we understand diagnosis in these terms, and again, let me just repeat, I'll keep repeating it. I am not anti-medical knowledge. Diagnosis is extremely helpful. It helps people to be healthy and, you know, so forth. But if we put it in that context where it's a bit unsettled in a productive way, then I think that that's what can lay the groundwork for having a richer context for these kind of metagnostic revelations. And this is where well-trained humanistic clinicians and people in your life can be really helpful. So you get that anomalous MRI scan or the blood result or the 23andMe predisposition thing or whatever, and you have a partner who can say, you know, partner in this process, who can, you know, where you're in dialogue with them and they can say, yes, this is this thing, but you know what? Let's understand this in the context that if we scanned all of our brains, we'd find anomalies in everybody. And maybe you never had to think about it before because you're not a neurologist, but we can talk about it, right? And I don't think that's a conversation that's really as widely had. I mean, I did have some of that kind of interaction in my own personal health journey, and it was very helpful. But it was the kind of information that it would have been hard for me to get otherwise because these things aren't as widely discussed. So I think this is where education, healthcare education, and bringing people into common dialogue who are in healthcare and outside of healthcare, because we are all united by having bodies, is a productive thing. But thank you for the question, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Rita. And it occurs to me, Danielle, that this conversation is happening in healthcare, but in different corners of healthcare, because the phenomena that Rita is pointing to has major implications with cost, has major implications with harm. Overdiagnosis results in overtreatment, and we also know that overtreatment results in harm. So I think this is happening in certain corners of medicine and healthcare, but to connect that conversation with the kind of philosophical inquiry that you are having related to identity and diagnosis is a bridge that needs to be created. Thank you for that. I wanted to move to Ali Kerr, who said she can't unmute herself. Is that still the case, Ali, or are you able to? Okay, let me read the question. I was curious about metagnosis and community. I know that for many folks who experience a moment of metagnosis, one of the positives of the experience can be discovering a community of shared experience and gaining access to shared knowledge and resources that may help with understanding or living in a particular diagnosis. Do you touch on that at all in your book? Good question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I think I do talk about that in the book. I think that's a largely positive aspect. You know, if something is helpful, it's helpful, right? I'm reminded, actually, one of the interviews that I did was of a Scottish ophthalmologist and vision scientist named Gordon Dutton, and he's referred all the complex cognitive visual impairment cases in Scotland apparently, and routinely they're misdiagnosed because these are conditions that are quite unusual. And he said he would often get kids who actually he thought should be properly diagnosed as having, for example, you know, mild autism spectrum disorder or something like that, or Oh no, sorry, the reverse, like that they would have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but in fact they had this cognitive visual impairment, which was causing them some kind of functional limitation, but nobody around them understood what was going on. But he said, he said that in Scotland, you know, the medical system is not so diagnosis based. You know, the US medical system, you have to have a diagnosis to do anything really. And he said in that case, it was really more about functional adaptation. And in those cases, the kids were getting the kind of support they needed. And so he wasn't really so concerned about the specific diagnosis. And I found that really illuminating. And so I really come, you know, in my exploration of this, there's no rule, you know, I don't come out with any kind of edict that this is good or bad or it's helpful or not helpful, because it depends. And if the revelation is helpful to somebody, that they find a support community, then that's a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. Just one more story, which is also in the book, which is another person who I interviewed who had a lot of difficulties in her life, and then she got a diagnosis of ADHD, and she joined a support group, and she felt that it was extremely beneficial. She felt this profound sense of recognition, and that this guilt and alienation, all this stuff that she had been experiencing her whole life, was really ameliorated by being amongst these understanding people. But then she actually had another revelation, which is that she kind of self-diagnosed with, and this is kind of a contested diagnosis, but she called it complex PTSD, which is rooted in childhood trauma. And so ultimately, and she's a physician herself, she's in the UK. Not all the people I interviewed are in the UK, but these two are. So then she felt that in fact she didn't have ADHD. So she had this complex PTSD instead, which has a lot of shared characteristics, but she didn't stop going to the support group because the support group was helpful to her. And she didn't really bother her that the diagnosis didn't fit exactly. So whatever is helpful to people, I think is a benefit.
Yeah. Danielle, thank you for this extraordinary conversation. I think this is the beginning of many enlightening conversations for this community and beyond this group. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to hear from everyone in terms of the questions. But Danielle, thank you so much. It's been an honor and pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you, Deepu.
I'm going to pass this on to Ssanyu, who's going to close this out.
Wow, thank you. That was incredible. I just want to reiterate, Danielle, thank you so much for bringing this to our community. And what really struck me is, well, everything that you said, but mostly about seeing the bonds of care anew. And also, I appreciated you acknowledging this is a privilege. Just being here together is a privilege. It's also a privilege that you have taken, you know, your knowledge and the wisdom and the research to create this book and to get it published. And I saw someone here asking a question around, you know, what does a new researcher, you know, going into the master's program should look for? And if anything, you know, Danielle, you speak to it as being truthful in your experience and authentic and vulnerable. So I just needed to say that. Thank you, because it really, this really moved me. Thank you everyone who joined in this evening for our first narrative medicine rounds of the year, of the academic 2020-21 year. We are missing being in this space together energetically, but it's really wonderful to see how we have culminated and created that online. So please do not miss out on our rounds next month in October. With Yuli Biss, and have a wonderful evening. Stay safe and strong, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you once again to Danielle Spencer. Thank you to Dr. Deepu Gowda, for Renee and Joe and the group at Columbia Medical Center, Narrative Medicine Downtown, SBS. Thank you so much, Rita Sharon, Dr. Rita Sharon, thank you. This was just incredible. And I look forward to seeing you all next month. And again, please stay safe and healthy. Good night.